Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video from the Tiny Menagerie. Hair algae is a sort of inevitable problem in the aquarium hobby. As long as you have an artificially lit box of fish and plants, you know it is going to strike you sooner or later. And once you do start to see those long strands, the likely chance is the algae is actually already quite well established, and it's now capable of growing from even the tiniest little bit, and it spreads very rapidly. Which is the first reason why it can be such a nuisance. Not only is it unsightly, it also grows so very fast, much faster than any other plant species, and will likely spread around the whole tank given half an opportunity. It's also fiendishly difficult to get rid of completely, and also very difficult to avoid because it's more often than not a hitchhiker that has come along with other plants or snails, and so it's not something you bought, it is just something you ended up with. But now that you've got it, how are you going to get rid of it? So, first of all, what actually is hair algae? And that's actually not so easy to answer, as it has many different forms, from the shorter, more robust species that slowly cover every surface in what looks like a scruffy green carpet, to those with long flowing strands that get tangled up in everything. And of course your tank can easily have many different species of hair algae growing in it, all happily alongside each other in one tangled mess. Personally, I've got quite a few different varieties going, and they include this little one that looks a bit like a Marimo moss type ball, as it tends to grow in these thick, strange looking clumps. I've got this short fuzzy job that looks a bit like fur on a rock, and I've got this one with luscious long flowing locks. But though there are many different species, they all have much the same characteristic. That being, they are all algae, funnily enough. They are all fairly simple plant life forms that are unable to anchor themselves, so they can't grow any roots in order to find any nutrients, and they rely entirely on food coming to them via the water stream. And just like other plants, they do need to produce sugars from light that they have conveniently found themselves bathed in. And when you're looking at getting rid of hair algae, it's worth making sure you don't fall victim to a couple of myths that you tend to hear said over and over again. Firstly, hair algae is incredibly inedible, much more so than many of the other smaller species of algae or diatoms or anything like that, and I have never come across any species of fish, shrimp or snail that will reliably eat hair algae. Some will nibble at it, especially when they're first purchased, but as soon as they learn that tasty fish flakes are on the menu, they will simply stop even trying to eat the algae. Certainly, you may well see them grazing from the surface of the algae. My shrimp love sitting in clumps of it because it catches passing food for them, but they aren't eating the algae itself. And I've seen it suggested time and time again that mollies or Siamese algae eaters will eat hair algae, but I have never known them to do so reliably. And in all honesty, buying a fish purely so that it can eat algae for you is a little bit on the morally grey scale, because what do you do with the fish once all the algae has gone? Or far more likely, when the algae is still there and now you have a bunch of fish you don't want either. So now you have an algae problem and a fish problem. Things are clearly getting better. The only way fish can really help with algae is if you have a surface scraping species that will eat biofilm, for example hill stream loaches. These can help prevent algae from spreading to those surfaces because they will eat it at a very immature stage, preventing its growth in the first place. But even these won't stop algae from growing on substrate or from plants, and they certainly won't reduce the amount of it that can grow in the tank. They will just restrict where it is growing. So in general, do not go thinking any kind of livestock that you will buy is going to be able to help with an algae problem. They simply won't, you're just adding to your issues. And the second myth is that hair algae can easily be removed by blacking out your tank. That is, completely covering the tank so that no light at all can enter it, thus starving the algae of one of those vital nutrient sources, the light. And this is very true. You certainly will kill hair algae by completely blacking out the tank. But hair algae is tough. It can live for months after completely drying out, just sitting and waiting to be rehydrated, and it'll immediately spring back to life, and the same goes for light. It can survive for months just waiting for the light to return. In the meantime, All your plants have died, and frankly, if you're going to black out your tank for months and months at a time, what is the point of having it in the first place? Better than a blackout, if this really is your final option, then it is better to collapse the tank down, give it a jolly good scrubbing out with simple soap and hot water, change all of the filters, basically start again from scratch. But even then, remember, if the tiniest little wisp of hair algae survives and you go back to exactly the same system that you had before, it will just start to regrow as soon as it is back in the water. But this is all starting to sound very dramatic, and there are far less dramatic ways to get rid of hair algae, so let's take a little look at those. And first of all, perhaps the most simple, is manual removal. This is time consuming, but it is easy. It can be done using a simple stick, or just some long tweezers or scrapers, anything that you have to hand. It involves gently pulling strands away from whatever growing surfaces they're coming from. And though, unless it is growing in a clump that is completely unattached, then you definitely won't be able to completely remove all of it this way. But you will be reducing the amount of it that is in the tank in order to give time for other plants to establish themselves. Do be careful if you are twizzling algae around a stick and then pulling it up, because it loves to get twisted around stem plants and you'll easily find yourself uprooting those when you're trying to pull the algae off. Best to just try and take tiny little bits of algae at a time until it is all gone from what you can see. Next, remove any hardscape that the algae is growing on. Any rocks, wood, bits of decorations, plastic plants, the filters, anything like that at all. Anything that the algae has managed to get a bit of a foothold on. These can then be replaced if at all possible, and if not, you can boil your hardscape in order to kill the algae off them. And if you've got really big pieces of hardscape, then you're probably going to have to pour boiling water onto them for a few minutes per section, just to make sure that you've got that algae scalding hot in order to kill it. But big pieces of hardscape are probably the least of your concerns, because plants can be much more challenging to deal with. You will need to remove any plants that are slow growing, as it will be very challenging to keep alive if they get covered in algae. This includes all of the Anubias and Bucephalandra species, for example. Because once algae starts to grow on these, the only way to ensure its removal completely is to cut away the leaf. And in a slow-growing species, this is going to be absolutely catastrophic. Best to just move them to another tank if at all possible, remembering that these slow-growing species are about as hardy as the algae as well. They tend not to need heating or extra lighting or anything like that. They themselves can survive for a very long time in very poor conditions, so it's not like you have to get a special setup for them. A bucket will usually do. If this isn't possible though, you'll need to very carefully wipe the leaves clean as soon as you see even the teeniest little bit of hair algae growing on them, just to make sure you keep that algae reduced as much as possible. Next thing to take a look at though is going to be your stocking levels. This tank, for example, is overstocked, plain and simple. It has way too many fish in it because my Danios decided to breed in here whilst I was filming them, and so now I have a scad of babies growing up in this tank. And because of all the fish, I also need to feed the tank quite a lot. And because fry are messy, an awful lot of their food is simply falling onto the substrate or getting caught up in the algae itself and then breaking down while it's there. These two yo-yo loaches I have in here are looking decidedly fat, but they're still not keeping up with the Danio fry and the sheer amount of mess that they are creating. And so, this tank now has a surplus of nutrients in the water, and the algae is taking full advantage of that. Ideally, I need to reduce the number of fish in here, but obviously I can't do that right now, not until these fish have grown up enough to be able to take down to the fish shop. And again, in all honesty, reducing your stock level is often the first piece of advice that you hear for reducing hair algae. But unless your tank is grossly overstocked, like this one, then having a few extra fish probably isn't the problem. It's the build-up of nutrients in the water that's the problem. Not the fish, it's that the fish aren't eating all of their food. That is then breaking down, that is then feeding the algae, and that is much easier to deal with. And so, instead of having to get rid of my fish, I can simply perform a 30 to 50% water change every day while the fry are growing up. This will keep the nutrients dissolved in the water to an absolute minimum, and it's going to give the fast-growing plants I have in this tank, in this case a Limnophila and a Rotala, time to get established, at which point they will start taking up a lot of the nutrients as well. And as these are fast-growing stem plants, if the algae does start growing on them, then I can simply snip off the offending bit of plant. Rotala will just quickly regrow another stem. Using a few leaves isn't going to bother it in the slightest. And once they are established, these plants will in fact be the absolute bane of algae, because they will keep stripping all of the nutrient out of the water. But, again, just because the algae is being outcompeted and the plants are now removing all of the nutrient from the water, doesn't mean that algae is going to vanish overnight. Oh no! As I mentioned before, hair algae is really hardy. It can live for a long time without food. But with much less food in water, its growth rate is going to be hugely reduced, and so it's probably not going to be able to colonise other surfaces, certainly not as rapidly as I can get rid of it. This gives me time to react. I can remove it as soon as I can. This means the tank will be supporting less and less algae, less food gets trapped in the algae, less food breaks down in the algae, less nutrient for the algae. Overall, we are eventually going to be going back to a level that can be considered normal for the tank, where algae shouldn't be being such a problem. But this is a long game. It is going to be me versus the algae for the next 3 to 6 months or so, keeping up with frequent water changes and removing as much of it as I possibly can before it becomes a death trap. And yes, long hair algae traps fish once it gets dense enough. And so though, part of the war against long hair algae, or short hair algae, or whatever kind of hair algae you've got, is accepting the fact that it is never going to be a quick fix. It is you versus a very hardy life form, and it is going to take some persistence in order to get rid of it. And in all honesty, if you've clicked on this video because you're in this fight with me as well, then good luck to you, quite honestly. Anywho though, I hope you've enjoyed this little video, mostly about me ranting about hair algae. Happy fish keeping everyone, and I'll see you again soon. Bye bye!